I've spent the last 20 years leading multi-organizational, multicultural teams on 3 continents across various industries. And in that time, I spent my best energy and my deepest attention on developing the leaders around me. In this series, I'm going to offer some thoughts on leadership, taken from reflections on how people have led in different ways at different times through this coronavirus pandemic. Lesson number 2, accept reality. As of this recording, Spain far and away has the most coronavirus cases per capita of any country on the planet. A lot of people like to look at this event and say, man, no one saw this coming, but we did. We just didn't accept reality, even though it was staring us in the face. Here, leaders knew that Spain is the second most visited country in the world. We knew what had happened in China, we knew what was happening in Italy, and still, we chose to hold a massive gathering in the capital city for Women's Day. Now, anybody worth their salt loves Women's Day. But what happened on Women's Day was tragic. Let me show you. This graph is from worldometer.com. You can see that the x-axis represents dates and the y-axis represents thousands of novel coronavirus daily cases. Now, these are just the recorded cases. We'll talk more about actual cases later. You can see the classic shape of the curve. We are on the back end of the curve here in Spain now. You'll also notice that the up end of the curve on the left side is jagged, and it's jagged in a predictable and repetitive pattern. It leads you to ask the question, what is going on with March 13th? To answer that, we have to go back to March 8th. March 8th globally is Women's Day, and on March 8th, even though there were hundreds of recorded cases here in Spain, the Women's Day March, the Women's Day Parade, the big gathering of 100,000 or more people in the center of downtown Madrid happened. And it happened even though Italy's hospitals were overflowing. And it happened even though Spain had already identified the fact that we had had community transmission within the country and that our first case may have died as early as mid-January. Now, for most people who get sick, symptoms usually appear about 5 days after infection. So what happened 5 days after Women's Day? On March 13th, there's a spike in reported cases. Now, until April 15th, yesterday, here in Spain, there hasn't been widespread testing. Usually only the people who are critical enough to require hospitalization or who call in with severe symptoms get a test. Now you can see the numbers go back down to the standard curve the next day. This strongly suggests that the extra 1,000 cases reported on the 13th that you see on that bar, they were all from whatever had happened on March 8th. Before getting tested, these people were all walking around spreading the disease for 5 days. Now what happened 5 days after the 13th? Now on the 18th, we see another spike. And then 5 days later, another one, significantly larger than the one before. What we're seeing in these moments are ripples from a decision made on the 8th. Now, all things being equal, this pattern should have repeated itself continually. Why didn't it? What interrupted the continual punctuated climb? Now, immediately after Women's Day, like the day after, the number of recorded cases shot up. It's really small on the graph, but it's a huge difference. Now that difference is interesting, and it might represent an increase in testing as people became aware of what was happening in Italy and increasingly aware of what was happening around them in Spain. What's more interesting is what happened on the 14th. On the 14th, the government noticed this massive jump in cases, and they instituted an immediate lockdown. Now back on the 9th, with that original little jump in cases, the government had instituted and mandated social distancing measures that asked people to be responsible, to wash their hands, to maintain distance, to avoid crowds, to avoid gathering when possible. But it wasn't until the government instituted the lockdown that things began to change. Now, when I say began to change, I mean that the curve began its potential to possibly flatten. The story began to be one that could end differently than massive jumps every 5 days and an exponentially increasing upward curve. The steps taken to ask people to take responsibility for their actions and to socially distance themselves were good, but because they happened too late, they were inadequate to stop exponential rise. And that's what happens with exponential processes. Actions taken very early can change things. Actions taken a little bit later almost never can. Now you can see it's 3 weeks from the institution of the lockdown before the curve begins to flatten. And that's because it takes about 5 to 14 days to start showing symptoms. People were still going shopping, people are still having to go to the doctor, people are still having to have babies. There's something interesting about that in a moment. People are still having to live in the house with their families, and so they're also getting each other sick. Now, for every reported case, there are probably 10 actual cases. The number of people who have COVID-19 is probably 10 times the reported number in your country. Now, that number comes from numerous statistical analyses and epidemiological models that have been put out. They're available all over the internet, all over YouTube. The most interesting one to me right now is one I saw just today in the New England Journal of Medicine. Apparently, there's a ward, a hospital ward in New York, where 1 out of every 8 women who come in just to have a baby, to deliver their baby, whether or not they're symptomatic, 1 out of every 8 women, it tests positive with COVID-19. Now, that suggests that there are about 1 million cases in New York City, not the number that is being reported. This is important to remember because whatever you're looking at with regard to what you're seeing on the news or what you're seeing on these graphs, the reality is that there are 10 times more people than what we are aware of walking around with this virus. Now, as I've been watching this graph, and boy, have I been watching this graph living here in Spain, you'll notice that on the right side, the case numbers will drop off and then shoot back up, and then drop off and shoot back up. And that is to be expected. What's important to notice is the shape of the curve going up and the shape of the curve going down. An exponential curve will go up sharply, and it will also go back down sharply if it's allowed to go all the way to its terminus, which in this case would mean millions and millions of deaths. Now, when you mitigate against a curve like this, when you flatten it, then it goes up sharply, flattens out, and then slowly declines over time. What's tricky here is that it declines slowly over time, and in that time, people are still in a lockdown and the economy is still turned off. Now, a reality that must be accepted is that economies cannot stay turned off indefinitely. And another reality that has to be accepted is that if we open up a lockdown early, then a lot of people are going to flood hospitals, very sick, hospitals that are already completely overwhelmed and won't have had time to recuperate from the first wave. If a curve like this can go from 2,000 to 7,000 in 10 days in lockdown, imagine what would happen if we opened the doors up at 4,000 or 3,000 outside of a lockdown, where people just socially distance themselves as they choose. That politically may be fine, and it may be the right decision, and it may not be, but the reality is if we do that, the curve will shoot into the sky again, and we may not be able to flatten it out once that happens. Now again here, I'm not trying to contend for one kind of decision over another. I'm just trying to assert that leaders have to accept reality. Leaders cannot afford to be pulled into political positions. They cannot be cajoled into taking a side on an issue when both sides of the issue are in fact true. When you are stuck between a rock and a hard place, calling one or the other harder isn't the answer. You just have to find a way forward between them. Now, to effectively navigate the future, we are going to have to continue accepting reality. There are things that we know. We know that nothing meaningful is going to change in this situation until the whole human population, the whole thing, reaches herd immunity or a meaningful level of vaccination. We know that the pace and severity of lockdowns can be mitigated against by the development of new treatments, which we don't have yet. So what leaders are going to have to do is they're going to have to continue being brave enough to accept reality as it is. And they're going to have to do some hard internal work to continue challenging the narratives that would prevent them from seeing reality. Accept reality. That's the only way we can build forward. And reality is the only place God can bless us.